Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're taking a completely impartial, deep dive into one of the 20th century's most complex, influential, and, frankly, polarizing figures, Mao Zedong. This is a massive story. We're talking about a collapsing empire, enormous ideological movements, incredible feats of nation-building, and some of the most devastating human tragedies in recorded history. We'll be sticking strictly to the historical record to unpack exactly how one man managed to reshape a nation of hundreds of millions of people. Okay, let's dive right into this. Imagine it's October 1949. Standing in Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong delivers this incredibly famous declaration: "The Chinese people have stood up." Now, to really grasp the weight of those words, you have to understand the century that came right before them. For decades, China had been just absolutely crippled by foreign exploitation, devastating opium wars, and deep, violent internal divisions controlled by local warlords. So when Mao spoke those words, he was dramatically declaring the end of an era of absolute national weakness. Section 1, the making of Mao. From farm to revolution. Now, what's really interesting here is how his early life shaped his entire worldview. Mao was born in December 1893 to a pretty strict farming family in rural China. He rebelled early on against his father's strictness and the rigid, traditional Confucian authority of the time, and that really fueled his ideological journey. But the crucial pivot happens when he starts adapting classical Marxism. You see, traditional Marxist theory, which was hugely influenced by the Russian Revolution, said that a communist revolution had to be led by urban, industrial factory workers. But Mao looked at China's reality and realized, hey, we're in an overwhelmingly rural country. He argued that the true engine of a Chinese revolution wouldn't be city workers, but the massive rural peasant population. And it's exactly this fundamental shift in thinking that allowed him to rise up through the ranks of the newly formed Chinese Communist Party. Section 2, the long march to power. So after the Qing dynasty falls in 1911, China is basically thrown into total national chaos. Let's trace this timeline to see how Mao actually put his rural strategy into action. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was founded in 1921. But things got incredibly dark by 1927 when the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, launched a massive, bloody purge of the communists. Thousands were killed. Forced to flee the cities, Mao retreated deep into the countryside and completely embraced guerrilla warfare. But he didn't just fight, he essentially built an alternative state system from the ground up. Out in these rural bases, he collected taxes, set up schools, established local courts, and demanded unbelievably strict discipline from his soldiers, insisting they treat the local peasantry with total respect to win their loyalty. And this rural survival strategy culminated in something you've probably heard of, the Long March in 1934. Fleeing nationalist forces, the communists retreated across thousands of kilometers of brutal mountains and swamps. In human terms, it was an absolute disaster. Tens of thousands of people died from starvation, disease, and combat. Yet Mao masterfully spun this trauma into a legendary propaganda myth. The survivors became this revered core cadre of the revolution, and the whole grueling journey officially cemented Mao as the undisputed paramount leader of the party. Then World War II hits. The devastating Japanese invasion in 1937 forced a really uneasy temporary alliance between the communists and the nationalists. Mao used this time to quietly expand his rural support even further, mostly by promising massive land reform. Once the World War ended, the Civil War picked right back up, but the tide had completely turned. By 1949, the communists won. The nationalist government fled to Taiwan, and Mao was left to centralize absolute authority over a newly unified People's Republic of China. Section 3, early rule and the Great Leap Forward. Now, Mao's early time in power is defined by this incredibly stark paradox. We're talking sweeping, rapid modernizations happening right alongside sweeping, brutal political violence. When you look at the historical sources, you see two very different realities happening at the exact same time. On one hand, you have genuine infrastructural and social gains. There were massive literacy campaigns. A new barefoot doctor system brought basic healthcare out to incredibly remote villages, which significantly raised life expectancy. Women gained new rights, including the right to get a divorce. But on the flip side, you have the authoritarian brutality required to enforce all of this. The state confiscated private property and held public trials that resulted in the executions of hundreds of thousands of landlords and anyone labeled a counter-revolutionary. The legal system became completely tied to ideology, and society was kept in this constant state of fear, where citizens were actually encouraged to inform on their own neighbors. By the late 1950s, Mao is getting frustrated. He looks at the Soviet Union's bureaucratic model of communism and thinks, well, it just lacks revolutionary spirit. So in 1958, he launches the Great Leap Forward. This was an insanely radical campaign with one goal: rapidly industrialize China so they could surpass Western powers. And he wanted to do this not through careful economic planning, but through sheer ideological willpower and the forced mobilization of millions of people. Let's trace how this actually played out on the ground, because it builds into an unimaginable crisis. Step 1, the state completely abolishes private property, forcing peasants into these massive communal living structures. Step 2, they divert agricultural labor away from farming and put people to work on primitive, practically useless backyard steel furnaces. Step 3, because failing to meet government quotas was incredibly dangerous politically, terrified local leaders started reporting fake, massively inflated crop yields to the central government. And finally, Step 4, the state, believing these totally false numbers, swept in and seized what little grain was actually produced. This chain reaction just completely destroyed China's agriculture. The result of all this? Modern history's deadliest man-made famine. Academic estimates of the death toll vary wildly, but they are all absolutely catastrophic. Somewhere between 15 million and 45 million people perished from starvation. The suffering was beyond unimaginable. Historical records talk about desperate citizens resorting to eating tree bark, and in some regions, even cannibalism. And through it all, the central state heavily suppressed the truth of the disaster for a very long time.
Section 4. The Cultural Revolution.
So, the sheer scale of the Great Leap Forward's failure actually weakened Mao's absolute authority for a while. More pragmatic leaders within the party had to step in just to repair the shattered economy. Mao, however, viewed this pragmatism as a direct threat to his ideology and, more importantly, his personal power. To claw back control, he launched the Cultural Revolution in the mid-1960s. He claimed that capitalist and anti-revolutionary elements were infiltrating the party and society. To purge them, he totally bypassed the regular party apparatus and directly mobilized the youth. He created these radicalized student paramilitary groups known as the Red Guards. And the scope of the destruction that followed is just hard to wrap your head around. The Red Guards were essentially unleashed on the existing social order. They targeted teachers, academics, and artists, often publicly humiliating, torturing, or even killing them. They destroyed priceless historical artifacts, burned books, and smashed ancient temples, trying to wipe out the old culture. Bureaucrats, pragmatic leaders, and literally anyone perceived as a rival, even longtime loyalists, were purged, exiled to labor camps, or driven to suicide. The entire education system ground to a halt. The country basically descended into years of total chaos. Right in the middle of all this chaos, Mao's personal power reaches its absolute peak, creating one of modern history's most intense personality cults. His portrait was quite literally everywhere. Millions of people carried the Little Red Book, which was a collection of his quotes treated almost like a sacred text, memorized and recited constantly. It was also during this time that his wife, Jiang Qing, who later became part of the infamous Gang of Four, amassed massive, completely unchecked political influence. Section 5. A controversial global legacy. As we get into Mao's later years, the story shifts toward a decline in his personal health, growing paranoia, and some highly complex global diplomacy. His foreign policy was honestly just as dramatic as his domestic policy. In the 1960s, he orchestrated a severe, bitter break from the Soviet Union, accusing them of abandoning true revolution, which actually led to armed border skirmishes. Then, in this stunning geopolitical pivot, he hosts US President Richard Nixon in 1972. It was a massive diplomatic maneuver that effectively ended China's global isolation and completely shifted Cold War dynamics. Throughout this period, Mao suffered from declining health, likely Parkinson-like neurological issues, before passing away on September 9, 1976. Almost immediately after he dies, the political landscape completely flips again. The radical Gang of Four, including his wife, are arrested. Soon after, Deng Xiaoping rises to power, initiating the pragmatic, market-based reforms that actually laid the groundwork for the modern Chinese economic juggernaut we see today. The official Chinese state verdict on Mao eventually settled on a very careful compromise, declaring that while he made severe errors, his achievements outweighed his mistakes. So the crucial point here is that globally, his legacy is intensely and perhaps irreconcilably debated. On one side, he's revered as the founding father who finally ended a century of foreign humiliation, built a unified, independent state, and inspired anti-imperialist movements all around the world. But on the other side, he is firmly judged alongside the 20th century's most destructive dictators, an absolute authoritarian responsible for mass repression, the erasure of immense cultural heritage, and the entirely preventable deaths of tens of millions of his own people.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought to reflect on. As you analyze the source material and the heavy historical events we've just covered, consider this. How exactly should history weigh the creation of a unified, modern superpower against one of the most catastrophic human death tolls of the 20th century? It's a profound, challenging question, and it continues to define how we understand modern history. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.